What you're about to hear from Zakaria and Ali Velshi is the history of South Africa that many in the West, especially Americans, have either ignored or been deliberately misled about. There is no white genocide happening in South Africa. What's happening is a correction of history, and the loudest critics are simply those who can't handle the discomfort of equality. But here's the real danger. The United States has a long, well-documented history of manipulating narratives in other countries to serve its own political and economic interests. When the truth doesn't suit their agenda, they twist it, especially through media, think tanks, and high-profile commentators. Right now, there's an active effort to portray South Africa as unstable, violent, and anti-white. Why? Because the reality that a formerly oppressed black majority is reclaiming power, land, and dignity without begging for permission challenges the status quo America helped build and once benefited from. If that story gains traction, it inspires others, and that terrifies them. If Americans fall for this false narrative, it won't just be about misinformation. It will open the door to dangerous consequences. We've seen it before. Demonize a country, spread fear, justify interference. Whether it's sanctions, covert operations, or funding opposition groups, the playbook is always the same. And South Africa is being lined as the next problem the West needs to solve. That's why it's so important to get this right. So please, like this video so it can reach more people. And if you don't mind, hit subscribe to support the channel. It helps us sneak this truth past the algorithm.
Trump recently posted, South Africa is confiscating land and treating certain classes of people very badly. A massive human rights violation, at a minimum, is happening for all to see. The US won't stand for it. We will act. The president then signed an executive order halting all foreign aid to South Africa and said he would prioritize granting refugee status to white Afrikaners, the ethnic minority who ruled apartheid South Africa and enjoyed its spoils. This week, 59 white Afrikaners arrived in America as refugees. As Robin Wright noted in The New Yorker, they are the only exception to another Trump executive order suspending refugee admissions. In other words, Afghans who fear for their lives because they worked for the American military will be turned back, but not Afrikaners. Trump claims that the South African government is seizing farmland owned by white South Africans, many of them of the Afrikaners community, who are descended from the 17th century European settlers. He also claims that there is, quote, large-scale killing, unquote, of white farmers in the country. So let's start with Trump's accusation that the South African government is seizing land. In January, South Africa's President Cyril Ramaphosa signed a new law, the Expropriation Act, meant to address a colonial legacy that started in 1913. That year, the Natives Land Act reserved 87% of all arable land for white people and corralled the black majority into the 13% that remained. Today, white people make up 7% of South Africa's population and, according to a 2017 government land audit, hold 72% of its privately owned farmland. Black people make up about 80% of the population and hold 4% of privately owned farmland. South Africa's new land reform law resembles eminent domain law elsewhere. It allows the government to take hold of land for the public interest. In exceptional cases and after judicial review, owners can be denied compensation. But in fact, Max du Preez himself, an Afrikaner, wrote in The Guardian earlier this year that not 1 square inch of land has been confiscated from white owners. As for large-scale killing of white farmers, violent crime is widespread in South Africa. According to a union made up of mostly Afrikaner farmers, there were 32 farm murders last year. That is a tiny proportion of the more than 26,000 homicides in the country that same year. South Africa's rampant crime is a grim failure of the government, but the government is failing all its citizens, not just white farmers. What we're seeing is that South Africa's post-apartheid governments have failed on many fronts. As inequality deepens, crime spreads, and corruption festers, it's easy to whip up racial animus. But there is no evidence that the government is confiscating white farms without due process, nor of any government complicity in murders of white South Africans.
Now, to understand the story well, we have to go back, way back, 373 years back, to April 6th, 1652. 3 ships from the Dutch East India Company, the Dromedaris, the Reiger, and the Good Hope, land on the shores of what will become Cape Town. That was the start of a 300-year project of white settler colonialism, which would eventually lead to a tiny white minority ruling over a massive black majority in and across southern Africa. 1652 was the beginning of one of the most brutally sophisticated systems of racial oppression that the modern world has ever known, a system that would in 1948 become entrenched into law as apartheid. Afrikaners, descendants of those French and Dutch settlers, called themselves Boers. The word Boer means farmer, and it's where the term the Boer War comes from. The Boers built their identity around independence, strict Calvinist values, and later the institution of white supremacy. They cited the Bible as justification for suppressing non-white people. The word apartheid itself didn't officially enter politics until the national elections of 1948 in South Africa, the one that took South Africa from being just a racist British colony into an independent and thoroughly racist republic. But long before that, British colonists and Boer settlers were already competing over which one of them could treat the black population worse. As I wrote in my book, Small Acts of Courage, they weren't trying to build a better society. They were trying to outdo each other in oppression. There was this belief among Afrikaner nationalists that in a truly democratic South Africa, one in which non-white people could vote, white people would lose everything. And they didn't just target black South Africans, whom they referred to with the derogatory term Kaffers. Indians, like my ancestors who arrived in South Africa in 1893, were called coolies, also a derogatory term. Colored people, the name for people of mixed race, were segregated, they were monitored, they were dehumanized. During that election in 1948, the National Party's campaign slogan read, it was an Afrikaans term, Die Kaffer op sy plek, die coolies uit die land, which translates to the black man in his place, the Asians out of the country. This was literally racism codified, defended, and exported. But then came 1994, a miracle, a revolution without a war. Nelson Mandela elected. White South Africans, including Afrikaners, held a referendum leading up to those elections in which they essentially voted themselves out of power. It was and remains a remarkable act of democratic humility. The Afrikaners knew the game was up and the future lay in a true multiracial democracy. Today, the South African government uses affirmative action and black economic empowerment to redress 3 centuries of economic and educational exclusion, their version of what one might call DEI. And yes, some white South Africans, Afrikaners included, say that this feels a lot like reverse discrimination. They point to quotas in public schools, shifting university admissions, government contracts going to black-owned firms. And just like in America, there are extremely poor white communities in South Africa, a situation that was only worsened since the end of apartheid, with whites losing their special standing in society. Afrikaans, once the dominant language, while still one of 11 national languages, isn't the primary language anymore. And farm attacks, heinous crimes, have happened. White farmers have been murdered in acts that can only be described as terrorism. In 2024, between October and December, 12 people were killed in attacks on farms. But the idea that these are part of a targeted genocide against white people, that claim has no basis in fact. This is where the story stops being about South Africa and starts being about America. In 2018, President Donald Trump tweeted that he would ask the State Department to investigate the, quote, large-scale killing of white farmers in South Africa. No data, no context, just the echo of a white nationalist talking point. Elon Musk, born in South Africa, has echoed similar sentiments, painting Afrikaners as victims of a hostile black majority government. Just this week, Elon Musk shared at least 20 posts on X about South Africa and what he calls anti-white laws. But ask yourself, is this really about concern for Afrikaners? Or are Afrikaners being used, deployed, as symbols in a broader American narrative that says white people everywhere are under attack? It's a way to justify grievance politics here at home, to stoke fear, to say, look, this is what happens when minorities take over. Afrikaners, descendants of colonizers, are being recast as victims of multiculturalism, pluralism, and true democracy, as messy and complicated as democracy can be. The story of the plight of the Afrikaner is being distorted to scare white Americans into thinking that they too are being replaced, pushed aside, and erased. So the question remains, are Afrikaners being discriminated against? Some feel they are, and they may be right. But South Africa today is not apartheid in reverse. It is the hard, necessary, often ugly work of repair, of justice, of democracy trying very hard to make right what was very, very, very wrong for more than 300 years. Let us not turn that effort into a weapon. Let us not borrow someone else's history to fight our own culture wars, because if we care about the truth, we actually have to care about all of it, even when it doesn't fit the narrative that we're trying to sell.